Hello there, my sleep fellows. Tonight, let me guide you through a tender love story where hearts remember, time softens, and dreams unfold gently beneath the stars. Lay your worries down, close your eyes, and drift with me into a world where love whispers quietly and everything moves at the rhythm of your breath. Welcome to Romantic Sleepy Story, where timeless love tales are told under the lull of night. If these soothing journeys bring you peace, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so we can share more moments together, night after night. Now allow your mind to wander gently through ivy-covered paths and candlelit, drawing rooms to a time where words were measured and hearts were hidden behind glances. We begin in the gardens of Netherfield Park, where something unspoken is just about to begin. The morning sun had just begun to stretch itself over the green meadows of the English countryside, warming the dew-laced petals of roses and chrysanthemums that lined the winding garden paths. It was a quiet hour, the kind of time that held its breath in peaceful anticipation. And there, amid the scent of blooming lavender and fresh earth, walked Elizabeth Bennet, her gown trailing slightly behind her, her fingers brushing the top of a hedge as she walked with soft steps and softer thoughts. Her heart was calm that morning, yet curious. She had always preferred the solitude of the outdoors where her thoughts could roam freely. The manor had already begun to stir. Distant sounds of breakfast trays and rustling skirts whispered from the windows. But Elizabeth had sought a moment away from all that. From expectations, from eyes, from judgments. She only wished to feel the breeze on her cheek and hear the birds sing their untroubled songs. She turned a corner around a tall yew arch and paused. There he was. Fitzwilliam Darcy stood in the sunlight, as if he belonged more to marble than to flesh and feeling. He wasn't moving, only gazing toward the pond beyond the hedgerow, as though the surface of the water held answers he hadn't yet formed the questions for. Elizabeth stilled herself, uncertain whether to retreat or proceed. The moment hesitated, with her. He must have heard the soft crunch of gravel beneath her slippers, for he turned, slowly, gently, and their eyes met. It wasn't dramatic. No wild gasp, no sudden flash of recognition, just a quiet, lingering moment suspended in the stillness of morning. "Miss Bennet?" he said, his voice low, touched with surprise, yet somehow softened by the light. "Mr. Darcy?" she replied, her lips curling into the faintest, most measured smile. Neither moved closer, neither looked away. The air around them thickened with meaning that neither could decipher just yet. In that brief exchange, something delicate was born. Not love, not longing, but perhaps a curiosity deeper than either was willing to admit. She looked away first, but not because she wanted to. Her gaze fell to the book in her hand, the one she hadn't opened since stepping outside. A collection of sonnets, ones she'd read before many times, but suddenly none of them seemed quite as interesting as the moment she was now standing in. "Do you often walk this path in the morning?" he asked, surprising even himself. "Not often," she answered. "Only when the house becomes too loud and the garden too inviting." Darcy gave the slightest of nods, as if he understood exactly what she meant. And perhaps he did. There was something oddly comforting about the way she said it. Unfiltered. Honest. He admired that, though he'd never admit it aloud. They stood like that for a little while longer, the silence between them broken only by a robin's call and the distant splash of a fish jumping in the pond. The morning was untouched by time, and the two of them, so often encumbered by pride and prejudice, simply existed. Elizabeth eventually turned, offering him a soft farewell nod before disappearing. Around the hedge she'd come from, Darcy stood alone once more, but something within him felt less solitary. She did not know it, but he watched her go. And he did not know it, but she felt his gaze linger, even after he was out of sight. There was no promise exchanged, no poetic declarations, just the faintest imprint of something shared. Back in her chambers, Elizabeth would later place her book on the windowsill and stare absently out at the morning light. She would try to read, but her mind would return again and again to the garden, to the quiet glance that had passed between them, and the strange warmth it had left behind. Darcy, alone in the drawing room, would find himself pacing for reasons he couldn't explain. He poured himself tea and let it go cold. He picked up a newspaper and forgot to turn the page. His thoughts, usually rigid and precise, felt softer, like parchment warmed by the sun. Neither of them dared speak of it. Not yet, but even in that, silence. Something tender had begun to form, like the roots of a tree beneath the earth, invisible but inevitable. And as the sun climbed higher in the sky and the manor stirred fully to life, two hearts in separate rooms beat ever so slightly, out of rhythm, yet ever so faintly toward each other. A new day had begun, not just outside their windows, but somewhere deeper, somewhere quieter. And as sleep begins to hold you gently now, my dear listener, tell me softly, what if love does not always begin with thunder, but with a single glance in a quiet garden? The air was still warm from the afternoon sun, though the sky had begun to blush with the earliest shades of lavender. Gentle clouds drifted slowly, like dreams not yet dreamt, and the fading light turned the hedgerows and stone paths of Netherfield's garden into soft silhouettes. It was a moment caught between day and evening, a time when everything feels both delicate and endless. Elizabeth stood once again among the garden's winding paths. But this time, she hadn't come for solitude.
Alone, she wasn't waiting, she wasn't hoping.
She had only returned to the place where something quiet had stirred that morning, as if drawn by the trace of a feeling not yet understood. Her hand gently skimmed the top of a rosebush, fingertips brushing petals as though touching something half remembered. The fragrance lingered on her skin, floral and faintly sweet. She sighed, not in sadness, but in a kind of gentle yearning she couldn't quite name. Behind her, footsteps approached, not hurried, not hesitant, just sure. She turned before he could speak, her eyes meeting his once more. This time, in the softened light of dusk, "Mr. Darcy," she greeted, her voice calm as ever, yet touched with something quieter. Something like memory, though the moment had only passed that morning. "Miss Bennet," he replied, pausing beside her. "It seems we are both drawn to this place." She tilted her head slightly. Perhaps the garden has its own magic, or perhaps it's just quieter than the drawing room. He allowed a faint smile, the kind that barely touched his mouth, but softened his entire face. They stood together without speaking for a while, letting the hush of evening wrap around them like a shawl. No need for words, no rush. Even the breeze seemed to move slower, as if time itself were holding its breath. Elizabeth glanced up at the lavender sky above, its gradient painted in soft streaks, pink, violet, and a deepening indigo along the edges. "I used to think," she said softly, "that the sky looked lonelier at this hour, before the stars appeared. But now I think, maybe it's just resting." Darcy turned to look at her, his expression unreadable but intent. Resting, he echoed. Perhaps it is, waiting for night to offer comfort. A moment passed between them, filled with the scent of blooming jasmine and the sound of leaves brushing against each other. Elizabeth stepped slowly toward a wooden bench, its back carved with delicate vines. She sat, folding her hands loosely in her lap. Without needing an invitation, Darcy sat beside her, not too close, but no longer at a distance that spoke of disinterest. "It's strange, isn't it?" she said after a while. "How some people talk and still say nothing. But others—" She trailed off, her voice softer now. "Can say everything by saying almost nothing at all." Darcy nodded, his gaze forward. "Perhaps silence is more honest than conversation." There was something profoundly safe in the way they shared that silence. Not awkward or searching, but restful, like sitting beside a window during a gentle rain, knowing that no words are needed to understand the beauty outside. A gentle breeze stirred Elizabeth's hair, lifting a strand across her cheek. Without thinking, Darcy reached out. He stopped, himself halfway, then withdrew, folding his hands together. She noticed, of course she did, but said nothing. Instead, she leaned back, looking up again. "The first star will appear soon," she whispered. He looked skyward. "And will you make a wish?" She smiled faintly. "Only foolish girls make wishes, don't they?" "Or brave ones," he replied. Their eyes met again, and something unspoken passed between them. The kind of moment that makes no sound, yet lingers far longer than any spoken word. The first star appeared then, small, quiet, and alone in the canvas of dusk. It blinked once, almost shyly. "I think I shall make a wish," Elizabeth said, her voice a little dreamy. Darcy didn't ask what it was. He didn't need to. They sat there until the sky turned from lavender to navy, until the stars multiplied and filled the heavens with tiny fragments of light. The garden darkened, shadows stretching long across the cobblestones. Still, neither of them rose. Neither wanted to leave that moment, that stillness. Eventually, the chill of evening began to settle gently into the breeze. Elizabeth stood slowly, brushing her hands down the folds of her skirt. Darcy followed suit. "Good night, Mr. Darcy," she said, her voice quiet but warm. "Good night, Miss Bennet." As they parted and walked in opposite directions, the air seemed to sigh with the weight of something tender, something that had not yet bloomed but had already taken root. And in both their hearts, a question lingered softly, not spoken, but deeply felt. What if this was the beginning of something neither of them had imagined, yet both had longed for? And if love, true love, arrives gently, like the stars, one at a time, in silence, would they both be brave enough to wish for it again tomorrow night? The moon had climbed high above the countryside, casting silver light across the rolling hills of Hertfordshire. At Netherfield, the lanterns had long since dimmed, and the household had surrendered to sleep. Only a few candles flickered in distant rooms, small reminders that thoughts often outlast the evening. Elizabeth sat at her writing desk, its surface scattered with notes and an unfinished letter to her sister Jane. The candle beside her leaned low in its holder, its golden light, casting long, sleepy shadows across her face and hands. But her thoughts were far from the ink and paper before her. They had wandered once again to the garden, to the man whose eyes held stories behind silence, to the words she didn't say and the ones she imagined he might have said had the night been just a little longer. She sighed and picked up her quill again, but instead of addressing Jane, she began a new page. Not to send, not to share, but simply to write what her heart could not say aloud. Mr. Darcy, I do not know what it is that passes between us when we speak so little, and yet I feel as though we have said so much. Your presence unsettles me, not with discomfort, but with possibility. You are a puzzle I had no intention of solving, yet here I am, tracing the edges of you in my thoughts. Perhaps tomorrow will bring clarity, or perhaps only more questions. But tonight, beneath this quiet moonlight, I find myself wondering, do you think of me as I do of you? She paused, staring at the closing of the letter. She did not sign her name, she folded it softly as if it were a secret too fragile to exist in daylight, and placed it gently beneath her book of poetry. Hidden, yet not forgotten. Across the estate, in a room dressed in darker tones and heavier books, Darcy too sat alone. A single lamp lit the desk before him, but his pen had long since stopped moving. An open journal rested beneath his hands, its pages filled with tight, thoughtful script. Yet tonight, he could write nothing meaningful. His thoughts returned again and again to Elizabeth, to her smile, quick and knowing, to her eyes which seemed to see more than he wished to show, to her silence which said more than any conversation had before. He reached for a sheet of paper and held the pen for several long moments. Then, quietly, deliberately, he began to write. She moves like wind through tall grass, quiet, graceful, and unaware of the way she changes everything in her path. I have known beauty before. I have known wit, but in her there is something else. She unsettles me. She calms me. I do not yet know which truth will remain. But I hope, though I cannot admit this aloud, that she returns to the garden tomorrow. When he finished, he closed the journal with a firm but gentle hand. Not a conclusion, but a pause. Outside, the moonlight spilled across the landscape in soft silver ribbons, kissing the tops of hedgerows and rooftops. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called out, a slow, lonesome sound that faded into the high night like a secret carried on the wind. Two windows glowed faintly against the darkness. Two hearts, unknown to each other, beat quietly in rhythm, not with urgency, but with the slow, warm pulse of something beginning, something brave, something tender. Neither letter would be read by the other, not yet, perhaps not ever, but in those private words, unsent, unspoken, something very real had found its voice. For what is love if not the quiet reaching of one soul toward another? And what are words if not the reflections of feelings too deep to hold in silence? As sleep began to settle into the corners of each room, as candle flames wavered and fell, both Elizabeth and Darcy leaned back into their chairs, exhaling long, soft breaths they hadn't realized they were holding. And in the hush of the moonlight, one silent question rose softly between them. Across walls, across shadows, across hearts. If tomorrow comes with clearer skies, will I see you there?
Again, beneath the lavender sky? Morning returned with a golden hush, spilling light across the countryside as if gently nudging the world awake.
Netherfield stirred once again. The clinking of porcelain at breakfast, the shuffle of skirts in corridors, and the faint conversations of a household waking into another day. But the garden waited. its hedges trimmed and proud, its roses blooming quietly, its paths brushed clean of fallen petals. It stood still, not as something forgotten, but as something hoping. Elizabeth, however, did not walk its paths that morning. She remained inside, seated by the drawing-room window with her hands clasped around a warm teacup. Her eyes often wandered beyond the glass, tracing the familiar curves of the hedgerows, the soft arch of the wooden gate, the very place where she and Mr. Darcy had stood. Yet she didn't go to it. She told herself it was coincidence that they'd met there, twice, that anything beyond polite recognition was only her imagination, that perhaps she had simply woven too much meaning into the way his gaze lingered, the way his words softened at dusk. But the truth whispered just beneath those thoughts, a gentle pull, quiet and constant. Still she stayed indoors. She laughed lightly at breakfast. She responded to Lady Bingley's endless remarks with practiced civility. She even read aloud from a novel she barely followed. But every so often, her gaze would drift again to the garden, and the garden waited. Across the estate, Mr. Darcy stood in his own silence. He had risen early and dressed with quiet intention. His boots were clean, his cravat was neat. He walked the halls, not with urgency, but with a steady breath and distant gaze. He passed the library, glanced toward the front entrance, then stepped out onto the terrace. The garden lay before him, kissed by the morning sun. He walked slowly, almost thoughtfully, toward the path where they had last spoken, his eyes seeking. Though he told himself he wasn't searching, perhaps she was already walking there. Perhaps she had left something behind. But the garden was empty. The bench where they had sat held only sunlight. He remained there for some time, allowing the stillness to settle around him. He touched the back of the bench with his fingers,
lightly, almost reverently. His mind replayed her words from the night before, her voice soft and clear, as if the wind still carried it. Maybe the sky is just resting.
He smiled faintly, then turned and made his way slowly back toward the house. The day stretched onward, long and filled with polite duties. An afternoon of card games, shallow conversation, and laughter that echoed without depth. Yet behind every exchange, both Elizabeth and Darcy felt the absence of something they couldn't quite name. Not a moment lost, but a moment paused. That evening, as the sun set once more and the first stars blinked shyly above the manor, the garden waited again. Shadows stretched long across the paths, and the scent of lavender returned to the air. Like memory, Elizabeth stood again at her window, watching the sky deepen. She thought of stepping outside, of returning to the path that felt more familiar than it should. But something within her resisted. Not out of fear, but out of wonder. What if nothing happened? What if everything did? Darcy, too, sat once, more at his desk. He opened the same journal, the same page, but he did not write. Instead, he simply sat in the presence of a name unspoken, of a glance unfinished, and so the garden remained untouched. No footsteps, no words, just the quiet. Company of rose petals falling, but even so, even in the stillness, the connection remained. Not weakened, not forgotten, only resting. Some love stories are written in letters, some in grand declarations, but the softest ones, the ones that linger longest, are written in the spaces between, in pauses, in glances, in a garden left waiting. And as you rest now, tucked beneath your own evening sky, I wonder if love waits as patiently as flowers do for spring. then what gentle bloom awaits them tomorrow? The sky was heavy that morning, not with anger, but with a softness that felt like longing. Clouds hung low across the hills, grey and gentle, like thick cotton draped across the sky. The earth below seemed to wait, hushed and still, as if holding its breath before a quiet confession. Elizabeth had ventured out despite the weight of the sky. She walked the narrow trail just beyond the garden, where the wildflowers grew in less orderly rows and the trees curved over the path like
a secret canopy.
The wind played gently with her shawl, lifting it with cool fingers and brushing it against her cheek. She had no destination, only a need to feel the world around her again. The rain, if it came, would be welcome. It suited her thoughts. It suited the ache that had quietly settled in her chest since the garden had stood empty 2 nights ago. Behind her, the manor faded from view, tucked behind layers of trees and distant roses. She kept walking, her feet light but steady, her breath slow and deep. The air smelled of wet bark, of earth preparing for a storm. There was something soothing about it, like the way a song can feel familiar even if you've never heard the words. And then it came. Not a thunderclap, not a roar, just a whisper of rain. It began with a few soft drops upon the leaves, a rhythm as delicate as fingertips on silk. Then more followed, falling in slow, sleepy patterns across the path, dotting her sleeves and hair with a cool tenderness. She looked up and smiled, not in surprise, but in acceptance. The sky had let go, and in that moment she did too. She tilted her head back and let the rain fall across her face, arms outstretched slightly as if welcoming the quiet blessing. There was no one to see her, no judgments, no expectations, just the sky, the earth, and her. But she wasn't alone. Mr. Darcy had also taken to walking, though not with the intent to find anyone. He had felt a restlessness that morning, a stir beneath his thoughts he couldn't ignore. The air had drawn him outside, toward the woods, where the world felt less precise and more possible. And there, ahead of him, through the misting rain and between the whispering trees, he saw her. She stood beneath a branch that bowed slightly under the weight of water, her eyes closed, her face turned toward the sky. Rain kissed her cheeks and dampened the strands of hair that curled around her neck. She was not running from the rain, she was dancing with it. Something stirred in him, not sudden, not loud, just clear. He stepped forward, carefully, slowly. She opened her eyes and turned, not startled, only surprised. Their eyes met again, as they always seemed to, and for a heartbeat, the rain felt like music. "You're not afraid of getting wet," he said, the faintest smile touching his lips. "And you are?" she returned, her voice light, the corners of her eyes glowing with mischief. "I am less familiar with the experience," Elizabeth laughed, soft and true. "Then perhaps it's time you learn." Before he could protest, she held out her hand. Darcy hesitated, just for a
moment.
Then, as if the rain had washed something away from his heart, he stepped forward and took her hand in his. Their palms met, warm against the cool rain, and together they stood beneath the canopy of trees, the world around them blurred, with mist and soft pattering. They did not dance in the way one might at a ball, with formal steps and rehearsed grace. They moved slowly, simply, as though swaying to the rhythm of something only they could hear. It was not about elegance. It was about presence. The rain grew steadier, tracing gentle paths down their faces, clinging to their lashes, soaking the hems of their garments, and still they stayed. "I didn't think you'd be out this far," she said, her voice quiet beneath the rain. "I wasn't planning to be," he replied. "But I find that the most meaningful things are rarely planned." Elizabeth glanced at him, truly looked, and saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Or perhaps had always been there, just hidden behind his careful reserve. They stood close now, though neither had moved. His hand held hers with a softness that surprised even him. Her breath mingled with his in the damp air, and everything else, the world, the rain, the weight of unsaid things, seemed to pause. The moment didn't need to be defined, it only needed to be felt. Eventually the rain began to fade, tapering off into a soft mist. The clouds lightened, and the trees whispered their farewell with a final shimmer of droplets falling from branch to earth. They stood there, still holding hands, as if not quite ready to return to what waited beyond the woods. Elizabeth spoke first. "Well, it seems the storm has passed." Darcy looked toward the pale sunlight breaking through the clouds, then back at her. "Perhaps, or perhaps it was never a storm at all." She smiled, this time more gently, and their hands slowly parted. They walked back toward the manor in companionable silence, the path glistening with puddles that caught the fading clouds like tiny mirrors. And as they walked side by side, hearts still damp with feeling, one question floated quietly between them. If rain can bring them together in silence, what would sunshine bring? Later that evening, after the rain had dried from the leaves and the hearths had been lit once more within the walls of Netherfield, Elizabeth sat quietly in her chamber. Her hair was damp, her slippers forgotten by the door, and her thoughts somewhere in the woods. Her hand rested against the edge of the writing desk, fingers tracing the grain of the wood as though it might spell out answers she had not yet found words for. There had been no declarations, no promises, no understandings spoken between them, and yet she felt it. Something had changed, not only in Mr. Darcy, but in her. She had expected to find in him only pride, only distance. She had convinced herself that his silence was a fortress, his reserve a shield. But this morning, under the softened grey of a weeping sky, she had seen something else. Warmth, gentleness, a hesitation that felt far more like hope than arrogance. She smiled quietly to herself, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. For once, her thoughts did not race ahead. She did not try to name the feeling. She simply allowed it to exist, fragile and luminous, like the final drop of rain trembling on a leaf. At the same hour, Darcy stood in front of the fire in his study, one hand resting on the mantel, the other at his side. He was not a man who let go of thoughts easily. Yet today's moment, brief and wet and wordless, had softened something that had once seemed fixed within him. He had taken her hand, he hadn't questioned it. And what surprised him most was not that he had done it, but how right it had felt, as though her hand had been meant for his palm all along. He knew what others saw in him, a gentleman of means, reserved, stern. Often thought proud, but with her, he felt none of those things. With her, he felt known, and in that knowing, he felt seen, not for what society expected, but for what he truly was beneath it all. He stepped away from the fire and opened the tall window beside his desk. Cool air poured in, tinged with the scent of damp leaves and distant flowers. He breathed it in deeply, closing his eyes. The night was not silent. Crickets hummed low in the grass, and the wind rustled gently through ivy along the stone walls. Yet somehow it felt quieter than usual. A hush, not of absence, but of peace. And in that quiet he admitted something to himself. He had misjudged her, not her character, for he had always sensed her wit, her fire, her compassion, but
her effect on him.
He had believed for a time that he could remain unchanged, unmoved, but love, even when unnamed, has a way of finding the edges of pride and smoothing them away. The following morning brought no grand reunion in the garden. There were no coincidences or crossings of paths. Life resumed in its own gentle rhythm. Breakfasts, polite nods, carriage rides through the countryside. But underneath, something invisible had shifted. Elizabeth found herself noticing the way his gaze softened in conversation, even when he said very little. He no longer seemed merely proud, but quietly watching, gently listening. And Darcy, in turn, noticed the way she now lingered in a room just a little longer. How she no longer looked at him with judgment in her eyes, but curiosity, and something softer than before. They had not spoken of the rain. They did not need to. Its memory hung quietly between them, like the scent of lavender after a storm. Present, unspoken, undeniable. At dinner, their fingers brushed briefly as he passed.
Her the bread. Neither looked startled, neither pulled away. Later, in the drawing room, as she read aloud from a worn book of poetry, he sat nearby, silent but alert, as if each word she spoke was a note only he could hear. Her voice, calm and steady, filled
the room like candlelight. And though the others chatted and laughed softly, he did not take his eyes off her. Love is not loud, she read, but lingers quietly, even when the world forgets it's there. She closed the book, and for a moment the silence was complete. Their eyes met, not accidentally, but deliberately, and for the first time neither looked away. Darcy gave the faintest nod as if to say, "I hear you and Elizabeth," in her
stillness, answered without a word. The room returned to motion.
Someone poured tea. Someone chuckled softly at the fireplace. But between the two of them, a bridge had been built, word by word, look by look, over the river of pride that had once kept them apart. Neither of them could have said what came next, but both knew something had begun, not with fanfare, not with sudden passion, but with the fall of pride and the rise of quiet hope. And so I ask you now, as your eyes grow heavy and your heart slows to the rhythm of their unfolding love, if pride is the wall we build to protect our hearts, what happens when love finds the courage to gently climb over it? The morning dawned cool and pale, with a sky that seemed hesitant to brighten, as though it too were lost in thought. Gentle fog rolled over the hills in soft waves, wrapping the landscape in a veil of silver and hush. Inside Netherfield, the world moved at its usual pace. Servants whispered through corridors, firewood cracked in the hearths, and the scent of toasted bread drifted into the morning air. Yet within both Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy, a different rhythm stirred, a slower one, a quieter one. Elizabeth had risen before the others and taken to the hills beyond the garden, not to escape, but to be alone with her thoughts. She walked through the fields where the grass bowed softly beneath her steps, dew collecting at her hem and the wind brushing her cheek like a passing memory. She had not seen Mr. Darcy since the evening before. He had lingered by the fireplace while she read, his gaze steady, his presence warm but unspoken. That night had stayed with her. not because of anything he had said, but because of what he hadn't. It was the silence that echoed. She walked further into the countryside, past old stone fences and low, moss-covered walls, the kind that had stood for years unnoticed, their purpose long forgotten, but their presence enduring. And as she walked, her mind wandered too. How odd, she thought, that a man she had once so easily dismissed could now fill her mind in such a soft and persistent way. She did not understand it fully, this shift in her. It had not come with drama or certainty. It had arrived like the fog, creeping, surrounding, gentle, but inescapable. Was it admiration, fascination, or something more subtle, something unnamed? She did not yet know, but she knew this. She missed his presence, not his attention, not his flattery, his presence, his quiet steadiness, the way his eyes searched hers, not as though judging, but as though trying to understand. She reached a small clearing and sat on a flat stone, wrapping her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. Before her, the valley stretched out like a watercolor, all soft greens and pale golds beneath a sky slowly lifting its veil. Back at Netherfield, Darcy sat by the window in the study, watching the same hills she now wandered. He could not see her, not through the trees and mist, but he felt her absence. It was remarkable how the absence of one voice, one glance, one quiet laugh could shift the balance of a day. The drawing room had felt less full without her. The breakfast table, though crowded, had felt empty. He was not a man given to whims. His life had been shaped by discipline, by duty. But his heart had started to rewrite its own rules. He did not yet know what Elizabeth felt, if anything. He only knew that when she was near, the world felt clearer, and when she was not, everything else faded into something pale and unfocused. He stood from his chair and walked the room slowly, fingers trailing along the back of a worn leather-bound chair. He paused by the bookshelf, reached for a volume of poetry, and opened it to a random page. A line caught his eye. "I have wandered many places, but none so far as the distance between your gaze and mine." He closed the book gently. The house around him felt too still. He needed air, not the kind that stirred in hallways and parlors, but the kind that moved through wild hills and open sky. Within the hour, he too had taken to the countryside, not in search of her, not deliberately, but in quiet hope of finding something that reminded him of what he was beginning to feel. Their paths did not cross that day. She returned to the manor by early afternoon, cheeks flushed from wind, fingers stained faintly with blackberry juice from a hedge she had passed. She carried a small cluster of wildflowers, their stems bent, their petals imperfect, yet beautiful. She placed them on her nightstand without thinking why. He returned near sunset, boots slightly muddied, the chill clinging to his coat. He did not speak much that evening, nor did she. But when they passed each other in the corridor before dinner, just briefly, just enough to pause, they exchanged a look. Not a question, not a declaration, just a shared knowing that they had both been elsewhere that day, but that somehow their thoughts had wandered in the same direction. And now, my sleep fellow, as the stars begin to gather again above their quiet hearts, I wonder, what are the roads that bring two souls together when neither of them is walking toward the other, yet both are moving closer with every step? Night fell slowly over Netherfield, like a curtain of velvet drawn gently across the sky. The stars blinked into view, one by one, tiny sparks in an ocean of deep indigo. A hush fell over the estate, not just of sleep, but of stillness, a kind of sacred quiet that only evening could bring. Elizabeth lay in her bed, the covers pulled lightly over her, her eyes half open as they followed the shadows across the ceiling. The wildflowers she had gathered that morning sat in a small ceramic cup beside her, their scent faint but lingering, a whisper of the hills still clinging to her room. Sleep did not come quickly. Her thoughts moved like slow-moving clouds across a quiet sky. They did not rush. They drifted. She remembered the curve of the hills, the feel of the grass beneath her palms, the way the morning air had tasted like rain still waiting to fall. And she remembered, more vividly than anything else, the look in Mr. Darcy's eyes, not when he spoke, but in the quiet moments in between. Those moments stayed with her. They lived in the stillness, in the pauses between breath. She did not know what it meant. She only knew that she wanted to see him again. Not in the hallways or dining room, but in the open, where their silences could speak more freely than words ever could. She turned on her side, facing the window. The moonlight touched the edge of her pillow, like a soft hand resting beside her cheek. Outside, the garden rested. Beyond that, the hills waited in sleep. And somewhere within those dreams, he lingered. In his own chamber, Mr. Darcy stood once, again by the tall window, his coat removed, his hair slightly dishevelled from the evening wind. He had not lit a lamp. He preferred the night, the coolness, the quiet, and the way it allowed him to feel without the world's gaze pressing in. He had thought of her too often today, not in flashes, not in obsession, but in slow, steady rhythm. Like a heartbeat, he had imagined her walking through the hills, the wind pulling at her shawl. He had pictured her sitting alone with her thoughts, her expression turned inward, her lips parted slightly in thought. And then he had imagined her lying in bed, much like he was now, not out of impropriety, but in wonder. Was she thinking of him too? Did her thoughts drift to their silences, their closeness in the rain? He turned from the window and lay down, folding his hands beneath his head. The ceiling above him was barely visible in the moonlight, yet his gaze remained fixed, as though he could trace the shape of her name into the shadows. He had never known a woman like her, one whose presence could bring calm without requiring conversation, one whose opinions challenged him, whose laughter startled him, whose eyes undid him. He closed his eyes and breathed her name once, only in his thoughts. Elizabeth. It was enough. The night wore on. The manor grew stiller, and sleep at last came softly, not with sudden dreams, but with slow unfolding, and in that sleep something stirred. Elizabeth dreamt of a path, winding, familiar, the garden, but not quite the same. The roses were taller, almost wild. The hedgerows whispered, not with wind, but with memory. She walked it slowly, barefoot, the stones cool. Beneath her feet, at the end of the path, he stood, Mr. Darcy. Not dressed as she had last seen him, but more simply, as though stripped of all titles, all armour, just a man. He did not speak. He only extended his hand, and she, without question, without fear, reached for it. Their fingers touched, and the world blurred softly around them. Not lost, just irrelevant. When she awoke, her eyes opened slowly. The room was pale with morning light, and the wildflowers had begun to droop in their little cup. She sat up slowly, her heart steady, but full. Across the manor, Darcy too awoke, his first breath deep, his eyes slow to open. He did not remember. The details of the dream not clearly, only a path, a touch, her name lingering like the last note of a lullaby. They did not speak of it. Neither would know that the other had felt the same wind, the same ache, the same silent longing that night. But something had shifted once more, not in the world around them, but in the world within them. The kind of shift that does not make itself known in words, but in the way one breathes just a little deeper the next morning, in the way one waits by the window a little longer, in the way two hearts, though distant, begin to align. And as the light grew stronger and the hills rose once more to greet the day, one thought moved quietly between them, across dreams, across silence. If the soul can wander while we sleep, can it find its way to love even before we do? The following days passed like pages in a worn book, each quiet, each familiar, each filled with spaces between words that said more than dialogue ever could. Elizabeth found herself walking the garden paths more often now. Not in search, but in rhythm. It had become her place of thought, of breath, of stillness. And with each step, her thoughts wandered not only outward, but inward. She no longer questioned every emotion. She allowed them to exist. Like sunlight filtered through the leaves, soft and shifting. Darcy, too, moved through his days with a new quietness. He was not withdrawn, not in the way that had once made others mistake him for proud. Instead, he seemed listening to everything, to the rustle of paper, to the soft clink of porcelain at tea, to the sound of her laughter echoing from the far end of the hall. It was not avoidance that kept them apart, nor was it hesitation. It was reverence, as if neither wanted to disturb what had begun so delicately between them. To name it too soon, to push it forward with words, might have frightened it away, like a bird startled by a sudden motion. One afternoon, they found themselves again in the same room. Not alone, but not surrounded either. She was seated near the window, embroidery in her lap, though her needle moved little. Her eyes, unfocused, lingered on the clouds gathering in the distance. She felt him before she saw him, that quiet presence she was learning to recognize without turning. He entered the room with no announcement, no fanfare. Just the soft sound of a boot heel on carpet, a rustle of coat, and then stillness again. He chose a chair across the room. Not close, but near enough. For a while, neither spoke. Elizabeth did not look up. She didn't need to. The silence between them was not the kind that pressed, but the kind that breathed. She stitched one row slowly, then paused. Her eyes lifted. He was watching her, not in a way that invaded, but in a way that waited. She offered a soft smile. "It's going to rain again," she said, her voice barely more than a thought. Darcy nodded. "It seems the skies have taken to reflection, much like the
rest of us."
She tilted her head, amused. "Do you reflect often, Mr. Darcy?" He looked down briefly, then back to her. "More now than I used to." She set the needlework aside, folding the cloth neatly on her lap. "And what do you find in your reflection?" His gaze held hers now, steady and soft. "That I was mistaken about many things." The words hung in the air, not as a confession, but as an opening. Elizabeth did not press him further. She simply nodded once, accepting it, and let the quiet return. Outside, the rain began, light and rhythmic, tapping gently against the glass. The room dimmed slightly, and a servant passed through to light a few lamps, their glow flickering against the pale wallpaper. Darcy remained seated, but his body leaned ever so slightly forward now, not in urgency, but in attention. His eyes had not left her. "I used to believe," he said softly, "that silence was something to be filled, that words were the currency of connection. But lately—" He paused, watching the way the lamplight traced the edge of her cheek. "I've come to see that silence has its own language." Elizabeth looked down at her folded hands. Her voice, when it came, was nearly a whisper. "It does. Sometimes silence is the only place where truth can exist." Their eyes met again, and in that glance, the silence bloomed into something far larger than either of them had ever known. It was not absence. It was presence, expanded. She stood then, slowly, deliberately, and crossed the room to stand beside the window. She did not look out, but simply rested her hand against the sill, letting the cool of the glass seep into her skin. He joined her. They stood together in the hush of falling rain, their shoulders nearly brushing. No words, no need. Outside, the garden blurred behind a curtain of mist, but inside, something sharpened. A closeness not drawn by distance closed, but by quiet understanding. Elizabeth spoke softly. "Do you ever wonder if there are things too fragile for speech, that once spoken aloud, they lose their shape?" Darcy didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was almost reverent. "Yes, often." She turned her face to him now, and he to her. For the first time, there was no pretense. No guarded glances, just two souls meeting fully, and still they said nothing. They didn't need to. What passed between them in that moment was not born of conversation.
It was not logic. It was not analysis. It was the silent blooming of something deep and enduring, the kind of love that does not ask to be named, only to be honored. And now, my sleep fellow, as your thoughts slow and your breath deepens, I ask
you this. What if the truest things we ever feel are not the ones we speak, but the ones we share in silence? The rain continued through the night, soft and steady, like a lullaby played only for those willing to listen. It fell against the windows, the rooftops, the waiting earth, soaking everything with a hush that seemed to echo within both their hearts. Elizabeth lay awake again, not in restlessness, but in reverie. The scene by the window replayed in her mind, like a gentle tide. His nearness, the shared silence, the way neither of them had spoken, and yet something had been undeniably said. It was unlike anything she had experienced before. There had been no grand gestures, no words of affection. And yet the silence had wrapped around them like a vow, a promise made in quiet and understood in full. She turned onto her side, pulling the blanket close around her shoulders. The room was dim, the candle long extinguished, but the rain had become her companion, a steady presence that filled the spaces left by unanswered questions. Why had she not spoken? Why had he not? And yet, she felt no regret. Sometimes, she thought, words only confuse what is already clear. Across the house, Darcy sat once again in his study, though the hour had passed midnight. The fire burned low, and the single candle by his side flickered with the breeze that crept in beneath the old window panes. He could still see her standing beside him, not in vision, but in memory. Her expression, calm and open, remained etched in his thoughts, like the imprint of light after the flame fades. He had come so close to saying it. Not "I love you," not yet. But something that would tell her she had become the center of every quiet in his day, that her absence unsettled him more than any storm, that her presence had softened the world in ways he never believed possible. But he hadn't spoken, and neither had she. Not out of fear, but perhaps because they both understood some feelings cannot yet bear the weight of language. Some longings are still ripening, still taking shape beneath the surface of something gentle and new. He stood and walked to the window. The rain, outside, distorting the shapes of the garden, he could not quite see. He closed his eyes, pressing one hand to the glass, and breathed slowly. The longing was not painful, it was warm, steady, like something blooming unseen. In the days that followed, they saw each other often, but always in company. Small gatherings, shared carriages, walks with others close behind. And still they said little, but oh, how they felt. When she entered a room, he felt it before he turned. When he laughed at something rare and true, she looked toward him instinctively. They moved like dancers who had never learned the steps, and yet, somehow, never missed a beat. There were small glances exchanged across tea trays and bookshelves. Brief touches passed when hands reached for the same letter, the same ribbon, the same door. None of it rehearsed, none of it lost. Each moment carried a heartbeat. Each silence held a thread. One morning, Elizabeth passed him in the hallway, alone for a breath, no more. She paused just slightly. He turned toward her as if drawn. Their eyes met. She said nothing. He said nothing, but in that moment he wanted to reach out, to take her hand, to ask her something he did not yet know how. To phrase he didn't, but he smiled, and she smiled back. A soft, knowing smile, not of certainty, but of trust, of patience, of waiting. That night, as she returned to her room, she lit a candle and stood beside the wildflowers. They had wilted now, leaning into one another like old secrets. She did not replace them. She let them stay, their faded beauty a reminder that even the most fleeting things can leave the deepest roots. She opened her journal and began to write, not with clarity, but with feeling, lines that poured not from her mind, but from her heart. There is a silence between us that speaks louder than music, a quiet that wraps itself around me, filling my thoughts with the sound of his nearness. I do not know what comes next, but I know this. When he is near, I am more myself than I have ever been. And when he is gone, I feel him still. Not as a ghost, but as a warmth that lingers. If this is not love yet, then it is something just as precious. A longing that does not ache, but waits. She closed the book softly, the candle flickering beside her. And as she lay back, the rain resumed. A quiet echo, a faithful rhythm. In another room, he stood beside the hearth, her name once more on the edge of his thoughts. He did not say it. He did not need to, for even in longing there was peace. Even in waiting there was presence. Even in silence there was love, growing, patient and full. And now, my gentle listener, as your breath slows and your thoughts begin to fade into dreams, tell me softly, what if love does not rush in like thunder, but instead arrives as longing, wrapped in silence, waiting to be held? The leaves had begun to turn. Summer, once bold and full of light, had slipped gently into the embrace of early autumn. The countryside glowed in shades of rust and gold, the air carrying the scent of ripening fruit and distant fires. There was a hush in the land, the kind that comes not from silence, but from change. It had been 3 weeks since Elizabeth left Netherfield. 3 weeks since she walked the familiar halls of the manor, since she wandered the garden paths, since her eyes met his across a crowded room or through a window pane painted with rain. And though she returned to Longbourn, to the rhythm of her family and the laughter of younger sisters, her heart did not quite come home with her. It lingered elsewhere, in quiet corners of memory, in words never spoken, and in the steady presence of a man who had once unsettled her and now simply stayed. He was in her thoughts as she read beneath the tree behind the house, as she poured tea at breakfast, as she sat at her writing desk and watched the breeze toy with her curtain. Not always in the forefront, not always sharply, but always there. Darcy, too, returned to his estate. His days were full. Meetings, correspondence,
long rides along the edges of his land. Yet something remained absent. Or perhaps
someone. He was not a man prone to restlessness, yet his soul stirred now like the trees touched by the first winds of autumn. He missed her. Not with desperation, not with ache, with calm certainty, with quiet longing. He missed the way she looked
at the world, as though it constantly surprised her, and she welcomed every surprise. He missed the silences they shared, not empty,
but full. He missed the sound of her voice, the way it softened when she read aloud, the way it sharpened when she challenged him. And so when the invitation came, a simple letter delivered to both estates, neither needed to consider their reply. A harvest gathering at the home of mutual friends, a celebration of the season, a reunion of acquaintances, an inevitability. The evening arrived wrapped in wind and gold. Lanterns were strung along tree branches, their glow warming the garden paths as guests gathered in cloaks and autumn colours. Laughter mingled with the scent of baked apples and cinnamon. A small quartet played beneath the terrace, and the stars peeked out, shy and early. Elizabeth arrived just as the last light faded. She wore a deep green gown that caught the firelight and held it in folds like quiet secrets. Her hair was pulled back in soft braids, a few wisps escaping with the breeze. She stepped into the garden slowly, her gaze moving not with expectation, but with hope she dared not name. And then, through the gathered guests and dancing shadows, she saw him. He was standing beneath an old oak, speaking to a mutual acquaintance. His coat was dark, his presence calm, unchanged. Yet something within him had softened. Even from a distance, she could feel it. As if her gaze called to him, he turned, and their eyes met. It wasn't surprise that filled the space between them. It was recognition, as though they had both been walking toward this very moment, quietly, without hurry, trusting the path would bring them here when it was time. He began to move toward her, not quickly, not hesitantly, just certainly. She took a breath, felt her heart still, and met him halfway. "Miss Bennet," he said, his voice as steady as she remembered. "Mr. Darcy." A pause passed between them, not awkward, not unsure, just deep. "It's been some time," she said softly. He nodded. "Too much." Another pause. She tilted her head. "I thought of you." His expression changed only slightly, a shift behind the eyes, a gentle softening. And I of you. They stood in the middle of the lantern-lit garden, the world around them humming with movement, and yet it felt as though everything had slowed. I wondered, she said, if the silence would carry. He looked at her carefully, his voice low. It did, and it brought me here. Her smile was small but full. Then perhaps it was not silence at all, but something louder than words. They began to walk together, slowly, along the edge of the orchard. Not touching, not speaking further, just walking. The rhythm between them had returned as though it had never left. Soft, steady, sacred. There was no urgency, no confession, only presence. And in that there was peace. The moon rose above the treetops, silver and watchful. Their steps moved in. Time, not with music, but with memory. And somewhere inside both of them, without either speaking the thought aloud, one quiet truth took root. Sometimes love is not about chasing after what's lost, but waiting for what never truly left. And now, dear dreamer, as the evening deepens around your own resting heart, ask gently, what if reunion is not about returning, but about finally arriving where your soul was always meant to be? The garden was alive with warmth, not heat, for the evening air had grown cool, but a warmth that came from light and laughter, from familiar voices and the scent of cider and cinnamon drifting between the hedgerows. Strings of paper lanterns swung softly from the trees, their golden glow flickering across paths and benches, dancing across skin and silk and silent emotion. Elizabeth and Darcy walked without speaking at first, their steps in quiet rhythm. The gravel beneath their feet crunched gently, and the lanterns above swayed in time with the wind. It was the kind of walk where every sound feels more sacred, where even a footfall feels like a verse in a poem. They did not need words to begin. They had already begun. After some time, they came to a stop beneath a cluster of lanterns gathered in a circle of low oaks, a space almost carved out by the night itself. The laughter from the gathering drifted, to them only faintly now, as though the world had given them a little room of their own. Elizabeth turned to him, her gaze soft. This feels like a place made for things that don't yet have names. Darcy's eyes searched hers. Perhaps some things don't need names. To be real, a breeze tugged at a ribbon on her sleeve, and she caught it absently. He watched the motion, then spoke again. "When I saw you tonight," he said, voice lower now, almost lost to the night, "I felt something settle inside me, as though the question I hadn't realized I'd been asking finally had its answer." She looked down, her lashes lowering with the weight of emotion not yet spoken aloud. "I wasn't sure what it would feel like, seeing you again, whether it would hurt or confuse or undo me." Her eyes lifted, but instead it felt like breathing. He took a breath as if to echo her. "That's what you've become to me." Breath, presence, a place my thoughts return to even when I'm not aware I've sent them there. She stepped closer, not by decision, but by instinct. "And still we say so little." His lips curved gently. Perhaps that's what makes this so full. The lanterns above flickered again. One swayed too far and dipped low, casting light across both their faces, making every glance, every softness in their features visible and vulnerable. She tilted her head slightly. "Tell me something real, Mr. Darcy." He didn't hesitate. "I think of you every morning, before the sun breaks the horizon. Elizabeth's breath caught, not from shock, but from the quiet power of it. He continued, "And I've wondered, more times than I can count, what your laughter sounds like when no one is listening," she smiled. "It's softer than you'd think." "I imagined so." She looked at him then, not as a suitor, not as a gentleman of rank or means, but simply as a man, with his quiet longing, his steady heart, his words so few but so heavy with meaning.
"And you?" he asked quietly. "Will you tell me something real?" She nodded, eyes not leaving his. "There were days I thought of writing to you. Just to say nothing, really. Just to have your name on the page and know you'd see mine."
He said nothing in reply. But in the silence that followed, something passed between them that needed no confirmation. The garden lights flickered again, the breeze curled around them, playful but gentle. And somewhere beyond the hedges music began, faint, lilting, like the memory of a dance. He extended his hand, not with flair, not with expectation, just open. "May I?" he asked. She placed her hand in his without a word, and there, beneath the glow of lanterns with the stars peeking through the branches and the wind rustling the leaves above, they began to dance. No audience, no rhythm beyond the beating of their own hearts, no reason to rush. His hand rested against the small of her back. Hers settled softly over his shoulder, and their eyes remained fixed, not in formality, but in awe. The world around them faded. The lights, the garden, even the distant song, all blurred into the background of a moment they would not need to remember, because it had already become part of them. The silence held them as closely as their arms did. It cradled their steps. It blessed their turning. It was a conversation, not of words, but of closeness, of longing answered, of waiting fulfilled, of love arriving, and as the last note of the distant melody faded into the hush of night, they stopped, still holding.
On, still gazing, still speaking in the language of stillness.
And as your eyes grow heavy, dear listener, and your own breath slows to the rhythm of their hearts, I ask you this. What if the most important conversations we ever have happen in the spaces where no words are needed at all? The days that followed passed not like falling leaves, but like breaths, slow, unnoticed at first, yet deeply felt. After the evening of lanterns and soft conversation, something between Elizabeth and Darcy had changed, not outwardly, not in the way the world could see. But within them, something had quietly turned. There were no declarations, still no letters, but the distance that once felt necessary no longer existed, and in its place, a gentle closeness, one that made every glance heavier, every shared moment brighter, every word more meaningful. Elizabeth returned to Longbourn with the harvest gathering fresh in her thoughts. She did not speak of Mr. Darcy to her family, nor did she need to. There was a new lightness in her, subtle but unmistakable. She moved slower in the mornings, paused longer when walking past her favorite tree, and often stared at pages of her books without reading a single word. She had started hearing his voice in her thoughts, not intrusively, but like an echo of comfort. A line he had said, a word he had chosen carefully, a glance that stayed long after she'd looked away. And then came the letter. Not from him, from their mutual friends. Another gathering, this time for a few days in the countryside. A modest house party, small, intimate. She hesitated at first, but only for a moment. Her reply was sent with steady hands and a heart that beat just a little faster than usual. Darcy too received the invitation, and his reply was nearly immediate. It was not anticipation that moved him, it was clarity. He was no longer wondering what he felt. He knew. But whether she felt it too, that he did not yet dare assume. And so days later, they found themselves again under the same roof. A different house, a different season. Yet that same unmistakable pull. That same soft rhythm between them. The first evening was quiet. Elizabeth arrived in the late afternoon, her cloak lined with dust from the road. Darcy had arrived earlier and stood in the far parlour, speaking politely with another guest. But the moment she entered, he knew. She had not announced herself, but he turned. Their eyes met. She smiled, and something deep within him that had been waiting, listening, aching, eased. That evening, the small group gathered for music and warm drinks by the fire. Someone played the pianoforte. Someone read from a book of verse. But Elizabeth and Darcy found themselves seated just close enough to catch each other's glances, just near enough that their hands almost brushed when passing the plate of sugared biscuit. Still no words about what passed between them that night beneath the lanterns. Still no confessions. But in the flicker of firelight, in the weight of the pauses between shared glances, truth began to echo. Later that evening, as guests began to rise and retire to their rooms, Darcy lingered by the hearth. Elizabeth, too, remained seated, her gaze on the flames, her hands folded in her lap. He approached slowly, standing behind the settee where she sat. "I've wanted to speak with you," he said softly. She looked up, calm. "Then speak." He circled the chair and sat beside her, close but respectful. The room was nearly empty now, save for one drowsy guest and the low hum of embers. "I have said little," he began. "Perhaps too little." Elizabeth turned to face him fully. "Not everything needs to be said." He looked down at his hands. "Still, some truths deserve the dignity of words." She waited, giving him space. "I thought silence would protect what I was feeling," he continued, his voice steady but quiet. "But it only left you uncertain." "I wasn't uncertain," she said, eyes kind. "I was waiting." He met her gaze. "I do not love you because you are perfect," she whispered. "I love you because you are real." His breath caught, not visibly, not dramatically, but she saw it. "You've known your heart longer than I've known mine," she said. "But I've caught up now."
"And I do not intend to let it pass me by." He reached for her hand, slowly, openly. She did not hesitate. Fingers met, not with fireworks, not with trembling, but with the deep calm of something that had waited long enough. The fire crackled.
Beside them, outside, the wind stirred the trees, but within that room was stillness. And in that stillness their hands remained clasped, their eyes remained locked. No more need for silence, but no rush for words, just truth shared quietly, present, alive. And now, as your own night deepens and sleep begins to draw its soft veil over your thoughts, tell me gently, what if the heart speaks not with volume, but with certainty, and all it takes to hear it is someone willing to listen? Morning came softly to the countryside house. The autumn sun peeked through the trees, painting the garden with threads of gold and shadow. A gentle wind passed over the fields like breath, stirring the ivy that clung to the stone walls and waking the world with the soft hush of change. Inside, the house was beginning to stir. Footsteps in the hallway, the quiet clatter of teacups in the breakfast room. But Elizabeth lingered in her chamber a little longer, letting the hush of early light rest upon her like a shawl. Her thoughts were calm, not without movement, but steady, like a river no longer searching for its course. The night before had not ended with a declaration. There had been no kiss, no sudden promise, just the feeling of his hand in hers. Warm, steady. Sure. She had seen something in his eyes, not a question, not a plea, but a confession that had waited for the right moment to be received, and she had received it fully. She stepped out, into the garden before breakfast, her shawl drawn close. The grass was cool beneath her slippers, still damp with morning dew. The garden here was smaller than the one at Netherfield, wilder, less trimmed, and she liked it more for that, and, as if drawn by the same pull, Darcy appeared. He rounded the far corner of the house, his coat dark, his hair just slightly tousled by the breeze. He paused when he saw her, not startled, but softened. She smiled. He walked toward her slowly. They met by the stone bench beneath a creeping rosavine, its blooms now fading with the season. No one else was nearby. The world once again had made room for only them. "Good morning," she said, her voice lighter than it had been in weeks. "Good morning," he echoed, and for a moment they simply stood. Then he sat, and she joined him. They didn't speak right away. The breeze rustled. Through the leaves, a bird called softly in the distance. A leaf spun slowly to the ground, and time, if it moved at all, moved gently. Darcy turned to her. "I once thought," he said, "that love required certainty, that before I could speak it, I must be prepared for everything that might follow." She listened, her gaze steady. "But I see now, love asks only that we speak it honestly and trust what follows." He paused, then continued. "When I first met you, I could not have imagined this. Not you, not us. I mistook my pride for protection. I mistook your fire for defiance. But you," he exhaled, "you showed me that affection is not about taming, but about understanding." Her eyes shone, though she said nothing. "I love you," he said simply. Not grandly, not in desperation, just truly. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the words wash over her like warmth from the sun. When she opened them again, her voice was quiet but strong. "And I love you." It was not a surprise, not to either of them. It was a truth that had been growing like ivy through every moment they had shared, winding through silence, through distance, through every glance and wordless ache. A truth that had bloomed quietly, and now stood in full light. Darcy reached for her hand again, their fingers interlaced, and this time neither hesitated. The garden did not cheer, the sky did not brighten, but something within both of them settled. A long-held breath. Finally, released. They sat in that peace for a long while, not speaking, not needing to. It was the kind of morning that knew its own meaning. That didn't ask to be recorded or remembered, only lived, and so they did. Together. And when they finally stood and walked back toward the house side by side, hearts open, hands joined, they did so not with the thrill of something new, but with the comfort of something finally named. And as your breath deepens now and your heart softens into sleep, I leave you with this thought. What if love is not a moment of lightning, but the steady glow that builds in the quiet. Until one
morning it simply is.
The cottage was nestled at the edge of a small lake, its stone walls covered in ivy, its chimney gently exhaling smoke into the crisp autumn air. Trees framed the water's edge like quiet sentinels, their golden leaves reflected in the still, glassy surface. There was no road leading directly to it, only a winding footpath, soft with fallen leaves and worn smooth by time. Elizabeth and Darcy arrived just before dusk, their carriage slowing as the lake came into view. Neither spoke, but both gazed, out the window quietly taking in the place they had chosen together, not for spectacle, but for retreat. This was not a place for society, not for guests or appearances. This was a place for stillness, a place to begin again. The door creaked gently as it opened, revealing a warm interior. Wooden beams, soft candlelight, a modest hearth already lit. The scent of fresh herbs and kindling greeted them like an old friend. A small table sat near the window, 2 chairs angled toward the lake. A single vase of lavender stood waiting on the sill. Elizabeth stepped inside first, drawing a slow breath. It feels like a secret someone decided not to keep. Darcy smiled faintly. Then I'm grateful it was shared with us. Their bags were brought in and soon forgotten. They did not unpack right away. Instead, they sat side by side near the fire, their hands still gently joined, saying little. The silence between them had changed. Where once it was uncertain, now it was whole. Not a space to cross, but a place to rest. As night fell, they stood by the lake, the sky reflecting its fading color into the rippling surface. The moon had not yet risen, but the stars began to appear, one by one without urgency. The wind stirred the water softly, and Elizabeth wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Darcy stepped beside her, his arm brushing gently against
hers. I used to think peace was something earned, he said.
Something chaste. She looked up at him, her eyes quiet. And now? He turned his gaze to the lake. Now I believe it is something invited and accepted. Like love. She reached for his hand. He took it without looking, as if it had always belonged there. They returned to the cottage slowly, the gravel path crunching beneath their feet. Inside, candles flickered in the windows, and the hearth whispered with a soft flame. A kettle warmed on the stove. The world, outside and within, had settled. Later that evening, Elizabeth stood in the bedroom, brushing her hair slowly before the mirror. The room was simple, linens folded neatly, a small shelf of books, a blanket folded at the foot of the bed. She caught Darcy's reflection as he stepped into view behind her. He didn't speak. He only watched her for a moment, then stepped closer and placed a soft kiss at the crown of her head. She closed her eyes and leaned back into him. They remained there for a while, no performance, no pressure, just the shared nearness of 2 hearts finally at rest. That night, sleep came easily. Not from exhaustion, but from the safety of love no longer waiting to be named. The morning brought birdsong and light mist rising from the lake. Elizabeth rose early, slipping outside with a shawl over her shoulders and a book in her hands. She didn't open it. She only watched the water shift in the light, listening to the world wake slowly. Darcy joined her not long after, a warm mug in his hands, steam curling from its rim. "Do you ever feel," she asked quietly, "that you've stepped into your own memory?" He looked at the lake, then at her. "Only with you." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they watched as 2 swans glided across the surface of the lake. slow, elegant, silent. It was a time of healing, not from pain, but from waiting, a time of belonging, of home, not in place, but in one another, and as the sun climbed slowly through the branches, their shadows joined across the stones beneath them, long and gently entwined. And now, my sleepy companion, as your breath settles and your body softens into rest, I wonder, what if peace isn't a destination at all, but simply the place where two hearts, once wandering, finally choose to stop and stay? The days passed slowly at the cottage, as though time itself had chosen to walk beside them rather than ahead. There was no rush here, no sense of what should be done.
Only what was, and the quiet joy of sharing it. Mornings began with silence, not from sleepiness but from comfort. Elizabeth would rise first, her bare feet brushing against the cool wooden floor as she stepped lightly into the kitchen. She
would boil water, slice bread, and sometimes hum softly without realizing it. Darcy would enter a little while later, his steps quiet, his presence gentle. He'd bring her a kiss to the temple, a hand placed briefly at the small of her back, or a glance that lingered just a moment longer than necessary. They didn't always speak first thing. Some mornings passed without more than a smile and the clink of cups. But in that hush lived a language both of them understood, a language of small gestures, of choosing to remain near, of breathing in sync without even trying. After breakfast, they would often part for a few hours. Elizabeth liked to wander the edge of the lake, collecting smooth stones or leaves the wind had carved into perfect shapes. Sometimes she'd take a book with her, but rarely turned its pages. Darcy would walk into the woods behind the cottage, or sit beneath the old elm tree with a journal in his lap. Not always writing, just thinking, observing. And when they returned to one another, there was no need to recount where they'd been. The time apart was not absence, it was space, and the trust that love could stretch across a few quiet hours and remain whole. One afternoon, as golden leaves danced across the lawn, Elizabeth returned from the lake carrying something in her hands. A single, flat stone, smoothed by time and water. She offered it to Darcy without a word. He turned it over in his palm, studying it. On one side, she had drawn a tiny heart using charcoal from the cottage hearth. Imperfect, soft-edged, but unmistakable. He looked up at her. "No words today?" he asked. She smiled. No words needed. And he understood. They found joy in the simplest things. In the way their hands found each other while walking. In the way he poured her tea without asking how she took it, because he remembered. In the way she noticed the way he watched the fire flicker when he was thinking, and placed a book gently in his lap just when he needed distraction. There were conversations too, long ones by the fire, curled together on the settee. About the past, about fears, about the people they had once been, and the people they were still becoming. "I never thought love would look like this," Elizabeth said one night, her head resting against his shoulder. "What did you imagine?" Darcy asked softly.
I don't know. Something louder, perhaps. More sudden. But this. She placed her hand over his. This feels like the answer to a question I didn't know I was asking. He turned and kissed her hand, then whispered, "Then I'm grateful you asked."
As autumn deepened, the world around them slowed even more. The trees grew bare, the wind grew colder, and yet the cottage remained full of warmth, of light, of a love that needed nothing more than presence, to prove it was real. One evening, as they stood by the lake, watching their reflections ripple across the surface, Elizabeth turned to him and said, "Do you know what I see in you?" He shook his head gently. "A place to rest, a place to return to." And he answered, "That's what I see in you too." They did not speak of forever. They did not speak of promises, because in this moment, in this time, they had carved for themselves. They were already living it. No future was needed to justify the present. No vow was needed to sanctify the stillness. They belonged to each other, to the silence, to the slow, gentle rhythm of days where nothing extraordinary happened, except that love was felt in every breath. And now, my gentle listener, as you drift deeper into rest, I leave you with this. What if real love doesn't speak in grand declarations, but in the quietest of days, where every shared silence is a sentence and every moment of presence is a poem? The cottage lay quiet beneath a sky awash in stars. It was one of those rare nights where the heavens seemed closer, as though the veil between the earth and sky had thinned just enough to let the light reach deeper, to let the wonder feel nearer. The lake, black as ink, held every star's reflection like a mirror of the infinite. Elizabeth stepped outside first, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her feet moving slowly along the familiar path to the edge of the water. The wind had quieted for the evening. The trees stood still. Only the sound of the water lapping gently at the shore broke the hush. Behind her, the door creaked softly open, and she felt the presence before hearing the steps. Darcy joined her without a word. They stood side by side beneath the blanket of constellations, gazing upward as the sky unfolded above them. No moon tonight, just stars, 1,000 tiny lamps lit by the breath of time itself. Elizabeth looked toward him, her profile bathed in starlight. "It's strange," she said, "how something so far away can feel so close." He followed her gaze. "Perhaps it isn't distance that defines closeness. Perhaps it's presence." She smiled gently, turning her attention back to the sky.
"I wonder how many nights passed before we both looked up at the same stars from different places." He let the silence linger a moment before replying, "And now we look at them together." She moved closer, just slightly, her arm brushing
his. Their hands found each other with practiced ease, fingers locking like pages in a well-read book. "Do you ever think," she asked softly, "of what we might have missed?
Had we not come back to this?" He looked at her, his eyes steady. "I think of how close we came to losing something we hadn't yet found." Their hands tightened, not in fear, but in gratitude. "I used to think love came in a single moment," she continued, "a realization that struck all at once.
But now I know. It builds, quietly, in glances, in silences, in mornings shared, and evenings like this. And in remembering," he added. She nodded. "Yes." And in remembering, they sat on the bench by the lake, the stars still glittering. Above, their reflections trembling softly in the water. Time passed without urgency. Darcy reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of parchment. Elizabeth turned toward him, surprised but curious. He opened it and handed it to her. It was not long, only a few lines written in his careful, deliberate script. "I do not know the moment I first loved you, but I remember the first moment I understood that I never wanted to live a life where you were not beside me. This is not a proposal, not yet. This is a promise. that I will choose you every day, in every season, in every silence, for as long as I am able to choose anything at
All. Elizabeth read it slowly, her eyes shining in the starlight.
She said nothing at first, only folded it carefully, holding it with both hands pressed to her chest. Then she leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. "I accept," she whispered. "Not a proposal, but the promise." He placed a soft kiss to the crown of her head. There were no tears, no fluttering hearts or rushed declarations, just stillness, just peace. And above them, the stars continued to glow, not brighter, not more dramatically, just as they always had. But tonight, they watched something quiet and beautiful unfold. A love no longer hidden in silences, a bond no longer uncertain. A promise made, not in the language of formality, but in the language of presence. That night, as they returned to the warmth of the cottage, their hands still intertwined, they left behind nothing at the water's edge, only a quiet echo of vows whispered under the stars, and the peace of two hearts finally at rest in each other. And now, my dear sleepy friend, as your own breath slows beneath your blanket of dreams, I wonder, what if the most enduring love stories are not made with fireworks or fate, but with the quiet courage to promise, and the even quieter strength to keep that promise every day after? The fire had burned low. Inside the cottage, only embers remained, glowing softly in the hearth, their warmth reaching the farthest corners of the quiet room. Elizabeth sat curled in the armchair beside it, her knees drawn up, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. The light of the fire flickered across her face, catching in her eyes like starlight that had followed her inside. Darcy stood by the window, one hand resting on the wooden frame as he looked out across the moonless lake. The stars still shone, above, constant, patient. But inside, the stars of their own story had begun to settle. Not dimming, not fading, just settling, becoming part of them. Elizabeth spoke first, her voice soft and even. "Do you think forever feels like this?" Turned, watching her for a long moment before answering. "I think forever is made up of moments like this," she smiled. Not brightly, not theatrically, but with the quiet strength of someone who finally believed in where she was. They had not spoken much after the promise by the lake. Not because there was nothing more to say, but because they had said all that mattered. Words had carried them here. Silence now held them. Darcy joined her beside the fire, settling into the chair opposite hers. Between them sat a small table, 2 mugs, a candle nearly spent, and the folded note she had not yet put away. He looked at her across the glow of the flame. "I once believed I had to earn a place in someone's heart," he said. "That I had to prove I was worthy before I could be loved." Elizabeth met his gaze, her expression calm. "And now I know. Love is not something we win. It's something we offer, gently, without demand, and hope, with all humility, that it is received." She nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "I used to think," she said, "that love had to be seen to be real, that it had to be declared or displayed. And now?" She looked at the fire. "Now I feel it most when nothing is said at all." A soft hush filled the space between them. Outside, the wind stirred the lake just enough to ripple the stars. The cottage creaked gently, as old homes do, not unsettlingly, but in a way that reminded them the world was alive around them, and they were safe within it. Darcy reached across the table, his hand brushing hers. "Would you come with me?" he asked softly. "Now?" He nodded once. "Just for a moment." She stood, slipping her hand into his, and together they stepped outside. The cool air met them like a second breath, and the sky above remained vast and endless. The grass beneath their feet was cold and damp, but they didn't mind. They walked, only a few paces to the edge of the garden, the place where the trees stopped and the lake began. And then they stopped. No grand destination, just stillness. Darcy turned toward her, both of their faces lit only by the stars and the soft glow from the windows behind them. "I never imagined peace could feel this full," he said. She leaned into him, her head resting against his chest. "I never imagined I'd find it in silence." They stood like that for a long while, arms wrapped around each other, not as a shelter from the world, but as a home within it. No more waiting, no more wondering, just this. The stars moved slowly across the sky. The trees rustled in low conversation. The lake mirrored their stillness, broken only by the softest breeze. Eventually, they turned back toward the cottage, together, hand in hand. When they returned to the warmth, to the low-burning hearth, and the sleeping walls around them, the world outside faded behind the wooden door. And inside, the air was filled with that rarest kind of silence. Not the silence of uncertainty, but the silence of knowing, of being known, of having arrived. Elizabeth placed the folded letter back onto the mantel, not to hide it, but to honor it. Not a beginning, not an end, just a moment, one of many. And as she returned to Darcy's side and they both sank into the quiet comfort of the firelight, one truth settled into both of them, deeply, completely, and without fear. They had found forever, not as a future, but as a feeling. And now, as your own breath softens and your body gives in to the gentle tide of sleep, I ask you one last time tonight, what if forever is not a promise spoken beneath the stars, but the stillness we share with
someone who chooses us, again and again, even when the world is silent?
The storm came 3 days after they returned, not in their hearts, not between them, but in the skies. The morning had begun gently, with the usual quiet rituals. Elizabeth stirred honey into her tea, while Darcy folded the letter he had written to his steward. A fire crackled in the study, and the scent of rain lingered somewhere just beyond the windows. Then the sky darkened. Winds picked up. The trees began to bend, and rain, soft at first, fell in long, sweeping waves, but inside the cottage there was no fear. Elizabeth stood by the window and watched as the rain raced down the glass. "It feels like the world is rinsing itself clean," she said. Darcy came to stand beside her, brushing her hand with his own. "Even the sky has its quiet griefs. Perhaps this is how it lets go." She turned to look at him, her gaze full and steady. "And we?" He leaned closer, pressing his forehead to hers. "We hold what matters and let the rest pass through." They spent the day inside, wrapped in quiet domesticity. She read near the hearth, her feet curled beneath her. He wrote in his journal, the scratch of his pen the only sound against the soft roar of the storm. Occasionally they would look up, exchange a glance, and smile. The world outside surged and howled, but within these walls the storm had no power. They had weathered their own storms already, the ones built from pride and misunderstanding, from longing and silence. And now, this rain, this wind, was only weather. That night, the storm passed. The skies cleared as quickly as they had turned. The moon emerged, silver and watchful, casting its light across the wet earth and sparkling branches. The world looked new, rinsed clean, as Elizabeth had said. They stepped outside into the hush that always follows such a storm. The lake, even in darkness, shimmered. The trees stood glistening in moonlight, their leaves heavy with rain. The air smelled of soil
and bark and something wild and alive. Elizabeth took a deep breath.
It's beautiful after the storm. Darcy nodded. Because everything remains. She looked at him. Not everything, just what matters. He took her hand and they walked along the edge of the garden, puddles glistening beneath their feet. The cottage behind them glowed with warmth, and the stars above had returned, unbothered, unshaken, and for the first time since returning, they spoke of what would come next. Not in fear, not in haste, just truth. I want a life, he said. That feels like this. She looked up at him, brow soft. Like this night? No, he whispered. Like us. They sat on the bench once more, the same one where they had made their promise, now glistening faintly from the rain. Elizabeth drew her shawl tighter, and he placed his coat gently around her shoulders. Will it always be this peaceful? She asked. Not always, he said. But even when it's not, we will be. She smiled at that. It was a good answer, not perfect, not grand, but honest. And enough. Later, as they returned inside, she placed another flower in the vase, on the windowsill, this one a single, small bloom plucked from the garden's edge. It wasn't brilliant, it wasn't showy, but it had survived the storm, and that, she thought, made it the most beautiful of all. She looked around the cottage, at the fire, the books, the shadows dancing on the walls, and then at him. There was a time she would have wondered how long this peace would last. Now she simply let herself live in it and know that they were ready for whatever came next. And now, as your thoughts drift into the soft quiet of sleep, I ask you gently, what if true love is not found in avoiding life's storm, but in finding someone who will stay with you through them?
And still hold your hand when the sky clears? Morning came softly through the cottage window, gilding the floor in threads of gold. It was quiet, not the silence of absence, but the hush of fullness, the kind that comes only when nothing more
needs to be said. Elizabeth woke first. She lay still for a long while, watching the shadows of leaves dance across the ceiling. The air was cool, the blankets warm, and Darcy's presence beside her steady, his breathing calm, his hand still, gently touching hers, even in sleep. She turned slightly, watching him. There had been a time when she thought love must burn brightly to last, that it had to be loud, all-consuming. But now, in the golden hush of this morning, she understood something else entirely. True love, the kind that remains, is quiet, like a thread woven through every breath, like a steady rhythm beneath every storm. It doesn't demand, it doesn't falter, it simply stays. She rose, wrapping herself in a robe, and stepped barefoot into the main room. The coals in the hearth still glowed faintly, and the cottage, though silent, felt alive, as if it breathed with them. She set the kettle on the stove, opened the window just a crack, and let the scent of damp earth and early sun drift in. Behind
her, she heard the creak of the bedroom door, then his footsteps.
Then his voice, low and half asleep. "You always rise before the world wakes," she smiled, pouring water into 2 mugs. "Someone has to greet the morning before it begins." He came up behind her, wrapped his arms gently around her waist, and rested his chin on her shoulder. They stood like that, quietly, until the kettle began to hum. They took their tea outside and sat on the steps of the cottage, wrapped in a single blanket, the lake before them shimmering like liquid glass. The trees rustled softly, and birds moved lazily through the branches. Neither of them spoke for a long time. There was nothing missing. No space that needed to be filled. Elizabeth leaned her head against his shoulder. "I used to imagine love as something I'd have to find," she said.
"Somewhere far away, as though it lived outside of me." Darcy turned to her, quiet. "But now," she continued, "I know love is not something we go looking for. It's something we grow, something we allow, something we choose." He took
her hand, kissed it once, and replied, "And something we protect." They stayed like that as the sun lifted itself above the trees, bathing the lake in warm light. The wind stirred, and with it came the faint scent of the garden below. Rosemary, rain and late roses. Elizabeth looked down at the garden path, the one they had walked so many times now. Each step along it carried memory. Each bend knew a conversation, a glance, a pause where silence had meant everything. "I don't fear what comes next anymore," she said softly. Darcy nodded. "Because now we face it together." They turned to one another, not in drama, not in sudden realization, but with the calm recognition of something already known, already trusted. He cupped her face gently in his hands. "You are my home," he whispered. She closed her eyes and pressed her cheek into his palm. "And you are my peace." The kiss that followed was quiet. No rush, no hunger, just a sealing of something long since joined. Later, as they returned inside to pack their things, for the carriage would come later that day, they moved slowly, not with reluctance but with reverence, because they knew they weren't leaving love behind. They were carrying it with them, in every folded blanket, in every page of the book she had marked with a pressed wildflower, in every note he had scribbled in the corner of his journal, and in the look they would share. Again and again, in every room they entered together. The storm had passed. The silence had spoken, and the promise had been kept. As they stepped onto the path together, leaving the little cottage behind, the world awaited, with its noise, its demands, its changes. But they walked forward hand in hand, hearts steady, breaths aligned. Because peace, now, was no longer something they had to find. It lived within them, together, always. And now, dear dreamer, as you reach the end of this gentle journey, close your eyes and rest in this final thought. What if love, the kind that stays, is not a storm or a spark, but a quiet return to the heart, where
peace has always been waiting for you?
The end. Thank you for listening to this romantic, sleepy story. May your dreams be soft, your heart full, and your sleep deep. Thank you, my sweet dreamer, for spending this gentle journey with us tonight. If this story brought you peace, comfort, or a smile, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon, so you'll never miss another heartwarming tale. Until we meet again, may your heart be light, your sleep be deep, and your dreams wrapped in love. Good night, and rest well.